wokeism is reverse bigotry. So like there's a history of bigotry in America and in many societies, right? But in my society in particular, there's a history of prejudice on the part of white people against blacks or dark-skinned people, whatever. Okay, and then there's also prejudice on the part of men against women and straight people against gay people. Okay, and a series of things like that. Okay, the woke people, they're not against bigotry. They just want to reverse the direction of it. Like, oh, so we used to be prejudiced against women, so we should be prejudiced against men to make up for that. And then we used to be prejudiced against black people, now let's have prejudice against white people. And okay, so it's just like they keep they have sort of the same attitude, but reversed, right? And so, like, that's what I think is the essential thing that's going on. Like, these people are some of the most racist, sexist, just like bigoted people, but they don't think that they are because they don't know what those things are. Right? They think that they're anti-racist, but they're actually extremely racist. Okay.
Hey everyone, I am José Mayubi, philosophy student from Brazil. Subscribe, like, and share to support my project of bringing top thinkers online. Today, my co-host David Ribeiro and I talk to Professor Michael Huemer about his moral theory and his new controversial book, Progressive Myths.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Michael Huemer. Hello, David. Thank you for support this interview. So, I first would like to thank Universidade Libertária from partnership from this interview, especially from Matheus. I would like to thank Beatris Seus and Filosofia No Grata from their support in the script from this interview. Professor Michael Huemer, it's an honor having you here.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's start the question about your new book, Progressive Myths. Professor Michael Huemer, what are some of the myths that you discuss in Progressive Myths? Could you name a few and explain them briefly?
Yeah. So first, something about what I mean by progressive myths. So these are factual beliefs that are widely held by progressives, contemporary leftists that appear to strongly support progressive ideology, but that are objectively factually false. Right. So an example of this is the gender pay gap. Right, false or highly misleading, let's say. So the gender pay gap, this is the idea that women get paid a lot less than men for the same work. So it's sometimes said, like you hear different things quoted like women get paid 70 cents for every dollar that men earn, or 82 cents or 85 cents or something like that. 85 cents is the most recent thing. Okay. And what's false or misleading about this is that that statistic does not control for occupation, hours worked, experience, or any other relevant characteristics that would affect how much you get paid. And if you do add controls for all those things, then the pay gap disappears. Right? So it's not different pay for equal work. Right? It's different pay for different work. Basically, the men are doing more of the things that you have to do to maximize your income. Okay. So that's a myth. Another one of the myths is so, like in America, a lot of people think that, especially people on the left, think that police go around murdering black people, just out of sheer racism, and that lots of unarmed black people are being killed every year. People on the left, a large portion of left-leaning people think that 1,000 or more unarmed black people get murdered by the police every year. Okay, so the correct number is 36, right? Or that was in one particular year. It's widely thought that there's a racial bias in police shootings. There's no objective evidence of that, right? So the reason for thinking there's a racial bias is that black people are only an eighth of the population in America, but they're a quarter of the police shooting victims. Okay. However, they're also 40% of the murderers. Right. So the people who are committing the worst violent crimes are also disproportionately black. That could explain why they're more likely to be shot by the police. Okay. People who kill police officers are 43% black. So if anything, there's a bias against white people. Right. Like the number of black people being shot is disproportionately low compared to the rate at which the black people are attacking police officers. So, All right, so that's a couple of myths. Those are popular in America.
So, Professor Michael Huemer, I have a curious. Uh, what are the most eminent and influential reference in moral and political philosophy you're thinking or your new book?
The most important influences. I'm not. I don't really do that sort of thing. Like, I'm not really influenced by people. I just look at reality and like say the way that I see it. So, and especially with like the progressive myths, well, there's not a particular person. It's just like I looked up these things. I heard these things about America, about how racist and sexist it is, and I tried to look up the facts to see. And whenever you try to look up these things, it turns out to be false, right?
It's
Um,
making some fact checkings.
yeah. Um, and I mean, if you're thinking about my academic work, like my work on ethical intuitionism, um, there were earlier ethical intuitionists, right? Like G.E. Moore and W.D. Ross. And the first in this sort of trend in the 20th century was H.A. Pritchard, right? And he has a very interesting article called "Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake?" which I thought was a brilliant article. So, I recommend that to aspiring intuitionists.
That's fine. So, Dr. Humer, what are the ethical issues associated with woke culture? What do
Um,
you think about that? What are your main troubles with woke culture? And what is woke culture by anyway? There are some
yeah.
people who say that woke culture doesn't even exist here in Brazil, especially. So I want to know
Yeah.
what is the definition of woke culture that you endorse,
Yeah, good.
and
Well,
what are the main problems?
yeah, so the answer to both of those questions is kind of the same, which is that wokeism is reverse bigotry. So, like, there's a history of bigotry in America and in many societies, right? But in my society in particular, there's a history of prejudice on the part of white people against blacks or dark-skinned people, whatever. Okay, and then there's also prejudice on the part of men against women and straight people against gay people. Okay, and a series of things like that. Okay, the woke people, they're not against bigotry. They just want to reverse the direction of it. So like, oh, so we used to be prejudiced against women, so we should be prejudiced against men to make up for that. And then we used to be prejudiced against black people. Now let's have prejudice against white people. And okay, so it's just like they keep they have sort of the same attitude, but reversed, right? And so like that's what I think is the essential thing that's going on. Like these people are some of the most racist, sexist, just like bigoted people, but they don't think that they are because they don't know what those things are. Like, right? They think that they're anti-racist, but they're actually extremely racist. Okay. But okay, and that's also the answer to what's wrong with it. Because people are not representatives of a race or a sex or any of these other groupings. People are separate individuals, with their own personality and their own lives to lead, and they're not responsible for the rest of their group. Right? It's wrong to blame people for things that they didn't do just because they belong to a group. Right? So
So I get it. So it's like people are trying to reverse the same things they suffered, or the certain groups suffered historically in certain countries, and they want to make some kind of revenge in your view. It's like making the turn, and well, keeping the fight between people from different ethnicities, different groups, different sexes, and well, they are repeating the same failures about the people who oppressed them before historically.
yeah.
That's just like that. It's like reproducing the modus operandi, but reversing the aims at least. Is that fine?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so like
Right. I
what
got it.
was wrong with racism? Right. So like, the historical traditional racism where white people are oppressing black people, what was wrong with that? Um, like one view is, oh, they picked the wrong race. It's actually the white people who are bad. Okay, that's like the most benighted account of what was wrong with it. No, what was wrong with it was treating people as representatives of a race. Like collectivism was what's wrong with it because each individual is responsible for themselves and not for anyone else, right? And races are arbitrary groupings. Like a classic example of racism was the Nazis thinking that Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. That's like classic racism. What's wrong with that? Um, isn't it true that the Jews killed Jesus? Well, what's wrong with it is that the Jews who killed Jesus are long dead. Besides that, Jesus himself was a Jew, but that's not, like the people who killed Jesus are dead like 2,000 years ago. So that has nothing to do with anyone alive today. Okay, but so like that's classic racism. But also, saying today, you want to blame white people for enslaving black people. The people who did that are dead, like hundreds of years ago. So like it has nothing to do with us today.
Right. So let's go to the next question. To start with, could you give us an overview of your version of ethical intuition, Dr. Huemer? What distinguishes your approach from other forms of moral intuitionism? There's some distinction there, or
Yeah.
your intuition is kind of some of the other ones that are in the vein.
Well, okay, so I mean, I guess I should tell people what intuitionism is, right? Um, so I guess there's a sort of like metaphysical doctrine and an epistemological doctrine, and then like a, I don't know, doctrine about motivation. Intuitionists think that there are objective moral truths or objective evaluative truths or something like this. So there are facts about what's good and bad, and or right and wrong. And these things are not dependent on the attitudes of observers towards the things being evaluated. So that's what's meant by objective. So, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Okay, and that would be wrong even if you approve of it, even if you like it, desire it, whatever, like whatever attitude you have towards it is still wrong. Also, if society changed their attitudes, if we had a society that approved of torturing babies, it would still be wrong. Okay, so it's independent of our attitude, so it's objective. Um, okay, so that's the first thing. And intuitionists think that these facts are irreducible, meaning that you can't explain it in non-moral terms. You can't explain what it is for something to be good without using some kind of evaluative term. So, like you could, um, you could use terms like value or beneficial, or like one, I don't know, one possibility is maybe the good is that which ought to be pursued or something like, okay, but then the word ought is a value term, so you can't explain any of these things without using other value terms, right? So that's what I mean by irreducibility. Um, and then there's an epistemological doctrine, which is that we have some kind of intuitive awareness of some of the evaluative facts. Not all of them, right? Intuitionists are not stupid people. They're not people who think that everything is self-evident. They're people who think that some things are self-evident, right? So sometimes you think about a particular type of action and it will just seem to you like it's wrong, right? And in my view, if something seems to you to be the case, then it's rational to assume that it is the case unless you have reason to think otherwise, unless you have a specific reason for doubting that appearance. Okay. And then the last thing is about reasons for action, that the moral facts give us reasons for action which are independent of our desires. And I don't think that's really defining of ethical intuitionism, but that is, one of the doctrines that I defend in my book, Ethical Intuitionism. Um, so in other words, like if something is wrong, then you have a reason to avoid doing it, regardless of your desires. Like even if you want to do the thing, right? Even if it satisfies your desires and doesn't frustrate any of your desires, you still have a reason to avoid the thing.
Right. Well, Dr. Huemer, many critics of intuitions argue that moral intuitions are unreliable. They're not trustworthy, especially given the diversity of moral beliefs across cultures. So there are cultures where some kinds of marriage are admitted and others are not. There are cultures where people accept, well, polygamic relationships and others that are not accepted. So how do you address the challenge of moral disagreement? What are your responses to the moral disagreement argument?
Yeah, good. So, first, there are things that there's widespread disagreement about, and so you mentioned one of them, like actually most human societies have practiced polygamy. It's something like 85% of human societies. Just historically, and most of these are primitive societies. Okay, um, but in our society, that's considered bad. Um, so therefore, what should we conclude from that? Well, you could conclude from that that you can't just assume, like maybe you should just sort of think about your society's practices and think about whether they're really the best. I don't think you should conclude that, oh, there's no way of saying anything. It's not the case that there's no way of evaluating this. No, we can think about whether polygamy is a good practice or not, right? So the fact that other cultures do it is like it's at least some reason for us to question whether our way is the best, but it doesn't prove that our way isn't the best, right? Okay, but then there are other cases where actually there's pretty widespread agreement, right? So like there's no society that doesn't have some kind of concept of murder, some kind of prohibition on murder. Okay, now, if there was such a society, by the way, it would have a hard time. You're allowed to just like kill people for the heck of it. Okay, now I'm not saying that there hasn't been a lot of murder. There has been a lot of murder in human history, but it is counter-normative, right? Okay, so um, disagreement, I think, actually does or should lower your confidence in certain particular ethical judgments, but it shouldn't lower your confidence in the judgments that there isn't disagreement about, right? Okay, and then as a related point, like one of the things we see over time over the course of history is we see people progressing in a certain direction and agreeing more. So like people around the world are starting to converge more on a particular sort of value system, which you could describe as a broadly liberal value system. Okay, so like it used to be that people, thousands of years ago and in primitive societies today were extremely illiberal. So like they would be hostile towards foreigners. So like they would make war on neighboring tribes and just like murder people. They just had like a really low threshold for doing violence. Frequently didn't recognize individual rights. They wouldn't recognize the equalities of the sort of like wouldn't treat men and women as equals and wouldn't treat members of different tribes as equals and so on. Okay, and we're progressing towards societies in which you recognize the moral equality of persons, you recognize the dignity of the individual, and recognize the badness of violence. Right? Those are like simple, broad points which might sound trivial, but they're not trivial in human history, right? Because frequently in human history, those values were not accepted. Now we're seeing more convergence towards them, okay? So if you thought that disagreement undermined moral realism, then when you realize that we're starting to get more convergence about morality, that you should take that to support moral realism.
Great
That's
answer.
right.
Professor Michael Huemer, classical question about moral philosophy. Can you clarify how you distinguish moral intuitions from emotional response? For example, how do you know when an emotion like guilt is mentally a more true versus when just a psychological reaction?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are different ways of kind of like trying to define intuition, right? So some people would define intuition so that it wouldn't count as an intuition if it's not purely intellectual or whatever. But I don't really do that because I don't want to have arguments with people over whether something is an intuition or not. I just describe an intuition as an initial. So it's an initial intellectual appearance, meaning that when you think about something, it will seem to you a certain way prior to going through reasoning or arguments about it. And so that the way that things seem to you could be influenced by your emotions. Okay, but I'm not going to say that it doesn't count as an intuition just because it was influenced by emotion. Okay, now you might think, oh, so then if my intuitions are influenced by emotion, should I trust them? Well, maybe you should, right? Like actually, you would have a hard time getting through life if you don't rely on your emotions. There's a reason why we have them. Like, like if you have, people who have emotional deficits actually have a hard time coping with life and making decisions and like doing things appropriately. Like actually, or your emotional reaction to people, like if you're interacting with somebody and you feel afraid, actually, there's probably a reason for that. And like you feel afraid and you don't know why, you should actually listen to that, right? Okay, so like it's like the emotional influence isn't necessarily a distortion. It could be helping you recognize real things. Okay, so like if you feel disapproval of something that somebody did and you're not sure why, it could be that there's a good reason that you should disapprove. You should disapprove of that. Okay. However, you should think about it. Like, when we're doing moral philosophy, if your emotional reactions differ from other people's reactions in particular, then you should try to think about why that might be, right? And see if like, maybe you have particular biases that could explain your emotional reactions, differing from others. Right. So, like I wouldn't say that emotional influence is necessarily a defeater, but it could be, right?
Uh, I have one question about this. Um, I remember you using an example. I think it was in a discussion with a utilitarian academic. I don't remember exactly his name. But you used an example about some people who are in the surgery, who are a surgeon. Uh, and it is trying to make a surgery, so he's having a kind of emotional reaction that in, it's inclining him to don't keep going in the surgery process, to
Oh
don't
yeah.
keep going and executing the surgery process, but he still feels like that's the right thing to do. And this
Yeah.
is a kind of intuition, an ethical intuition that it is due uh, to his position as a surgeon that he need to make and conclude that surgery because he was hired to make that work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what
So
that
yeah,
that
you're
is
doing the
an
surgery.
example that yes,
You have to cut
it's an
open the
example
patient.
that
And
illustrate that emotions are not intuitions, but they can be related, but they are not exactly intuitions. That's
yeah,
fine.
no,
That's right.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. So you have to cut open the patient and it feels bad.
Yes.
Like if,
Yes.
maybe you might say it feels wrong because normally you shouldn't cut people open, but you understand the reasons why that has to be done. When you think about it, you know that that has to be done, right? Like patient has a
Yes.
tumor, you have to cut it out. It's gross and it's not just physically gross, but it's sort of like, you know, it's stimulating quasi-moral emotions, right? Like that it feels like you're doing something bad. But you also understand that this tumor is going to kill the person. So like on an intellectual level, you know that that's what has to be done. That seems right.
That's right. Correct.
Pro Professor Michael Huemer, you bring point about reflection. It's where the concept of reflection equilibrium fits into your theory. How do you use the method to refine or adjust our moral intuitions?
Yeah. So reflective equilibrium is, well, this is this term that was introduced by John Rawls, who was good at coming up with terms that sound sophisticated, right? That roll off the tongue. So the idea is, well, okay, you're thinking about philosophy and you have some principles that seem plausible to you, but also sometimes you think about particular concrete cases and you have judgments that seem right about those cases. And sometimes the judgments about particular concrete cases conflict with your judgments about general principles. And so, like this happens with basically every moral theory that somebody has. You can come up with something that appears to be a counterexample. Like, so the theory sounds plausible when you first state it, but then somebody gives you this example, and okay. So, like, maybe utilitarianism sounds plausible when you first state it. Like, yeah, we should try to produce the most happiness, greatest happiness for the greatest number. That sounds like what we should do. And then you have this example like, well, what if like you have a healthy patient and like you could kill that healthy patient, then you could take 5 of his organs out and transplant them into 5 other patients, and then that would save 5 lives. And so like that would produce 5 lives of happy people, so it would produce more happiness, whatever. Okay. So yeah, the idea of reflective equilibrium is just that there's this kind of trade-off between, like there's frequently tensions in your belief system. There are different things that seem true to you, but they're not all compatible. And then you do this process of trading off and sort of like adjusting your belief system you try to make the smallest adjustments to they're the things that initially seem right to you. Try to make the smallest adjustment to the set of things that seem right to you that makes them coherent, right? And so, like, I think that's the basic idea. Rawls had a lot of this discussion about like trading off general principles versus judgments about concrete cases. But it really could just be any propositions, right? It could be principles trading off against each other, or you know, whatever the level of generality. And this is just like part of rationality, right? If there's a conflict in your belief system, then you should try to adjust it so that it's not in conflict. And, it's just rational that you should try to adjust the beliefs that you're least confident of, or the things that are least obvious. You should try to change those rather than the things that are more obvious. So,
That's right. So we have one more question, some more questions. One of the more common criticism of intuition is that it doesn't provide a clear mechanism for justifying moral beliefs to others who might not share the same intuition. So there are people who don't share the same intuitions as you, and you kind of need to deal with this conflict in some way. How do you address this concern, Dr. Hume?
well, I don't really understand this. I don't understand this objection. It's totally bizarre to me. Like, um, tell me some meta-ethical theory that somebody has that actually produces a technology to make everyone agree with you. If I adopt a different theory, okay, so like, there's like basically five different points of view in metaethics. There's, subjectivism, there's ethical naturalism, there's nihilism, there's non-cognitivism, and there's intuitionism. Okay. And like, so what? One of the other four, if you adopt one of those, then you're going to make everyone agree with you? No. Right? This is a phenomenon that's just like universal to human discourse that, well, people are going to disagree with you. So like, okay, well, so I give somebody an argument to try to convince them. Okay, what if they don't agree with the premises of my argument? What then? Then the argument doesn't work and it doesn't persuade them. And that's not like, it's not because I'm an intuitionist. It's because that's the nature of reality. If somebody doesn't accept your premises and there's nothing you could do. And yeah. And so, like, okay, what would be an alternative methodology? I could rely on pure emotions, emotional reactions. Okay, same thing happens. What if they have different emotional reaction? Okay. Okay, well, no, what if I try to deduce it from self-evident principles? Well, actually, it turned out that people have claimed to deduce ethical conclusions from self-evident principles, but those people don't agree with each other either. And the things that they say the things that they say that they're proving, other people think were not proved at all. So right. But by the way, like the fact that other people don't agree with you doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or your theory. Like, so like, okay, so I can't resolve the abortion issue. There are some people who think that abortion is wrong and other people who think that it's okay. And I'm not able to resolve that. So I'm not able to produce any argument that makes everyone agree. That doesn't mean that there's anything at all wrong with my theory, right? So it's just like it's a hard issue to resolve. So.
Right, right. Good response. How do you respond to the objections that moral intuitions might lead to cultural relativism? Because people have different intuitions and conflict with each other, that might not lead us to some kind of moral relativism or cultural relativism.
Relativism. Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay, so, we should like make the distinction, right? So the relativist view is basically truth is relative. And in moral relativism holds that moral truth is relative. So, in other words, what is morally right or wrong varies from one society to another. Related to the subjectivist view that it varies from one individual to another. Okay. That's not the intuitionist view. The intuitionist is not saying that intuitions make moral facts. We're not saying that you're having an intuition makes something right or wrong. We're saying that you're having an intuition is how you are aware of the independently existing facts. So, and this is analogous to how everybody thinks all other cognition works, right? Like any other area, when I describe how you know about it, like nobody gets confused and thinks that I'm supporting relativism. Okay, so like, how do I know about physical reality? Well, I have these things called sensory experiences. these sensory experiences are in my mind, right? And like my sensory experiences may not be the same as your sensory experiences. Like maybe we're in different places or whatever. Like maybe I have better eyes than you do. Like some people are colorblind, blah blah. Okay, so sensory experiences are subjective, meaning they're in the mind. They are also our only way of knowing about physical reality. And that does not mean that physical reality is dependent on our mind. Our knowledge of physical reality is dependent on our mind, but the reality itself is independent of us. Okay, it's the same thing with morality. So our ethical intuitions are mental states that are in our mind, and they could vary from one person to another. And maybe some people are better at intuiting the moral truths than others. But nevertheless, the moral facts exist independently of us. Right? Does that help?
Professor Michael
Right.
Huemer, can moral intuitions be systematically cultivate or development through education or reflection?
Well, I'm sorry. Say that again.
Claro, claro, no, sure, sure. Can moral intuitions be systematically cultivate or develop through education or reflection?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's like with anything else that people could get better at it. There's probably a limit, but like people would get better at ethical reasoning if they're just given a lot of practice. So, show them, give them a lot of cases, a lot of cases where there's some interesting ethical question, and then have them try to think about it, and then also have them read what some philosopher said about it and maybe think about it some more and then they read what other philosophers say about it and then after a while you'll get better. Okay, and like one of the things that will happen is that you'll just start noticing relevant features of a situation that you wouldn't have noticed before, right? And there's something, this is part of like a more general philosophy education. When you study philosophy for a while, you just start to think more clearly. You start to make more distinctions and not confuse things that used to confuse and just start noticing more relevant facts and okay, so you can get better. So there is probably a limit, so like, well, there's some people who are just going to be bad at it. There are some people who perhaps are not capable of moral reasoning. We call these people psychopaths. They just don't get the entire morality thing, so they may actually be untrainable, right? But like normal people, like non-psychopaths, can get it to some degree.
Right. Dr. Newman, do you propose that resolving cases where moral intuitions conflict can be related to or be compatible with a more holistic method of moral reasoning?
Yeah, so I think this is related to the reflective equilibrium question.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, basically, like, okay, well, you have a whole belief system, and just like any of your moral beliefs could conflict with other beliefs in your belief system. Like typically other moral beliefs, but there's moral beliefs and factual beliefs that combine together, and sometimes they conflict. And basically, what you want is the most plausible overall system, right? So it's sort of like, um, oh, like you have thousands of beliefs or whatever, maybe millions, I don't know. You sort of like you want to make the minimum overall adjustment. Right? So you're like, okay, well, I could adjust this belief, or I'd have to adjust these two. And okay. And then you sort of like take into account the plausibility of each of these beliefs. And you try to see what is the minimum adjustment that you have to make. um, and there are like some sort of holistic considerations like how simple and um, how overall simple your belief system is and how explanatory it is, and like those could be relevant.
Right. What do you think about the objection coming from evolutionary theory, Dr. Huemer? How do you respond to evolutionary debunking arguments? Did evolution truly undermines our basis for thinking that moral intuitions track some moral truths and moral facts? What do you think about the different versions? You know about some kinds of versions that are at least in terms of facts relevant, in terms of the epistemic access of these facts, and those versions that are teleological. Do you know these kinds of distinctions, Dr. Hume?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about that last thing that you were talking about.
Right,
Um, but so yeah, in general, well, I'm not especially impressed with the evolutionary debunking. But so um, I mean, I think my most interesting response is that we've seen a development of human values over the course of human history. So we've seen across societies across the world, we've seen the movement of values in a certain direction. All right, so slavery was widely practiced in human history, and today slavery is illegal in every country in the world. All right, so that's a remarkable shift over time. And then, there used to be a lot more war, a lot more killing people for trivial reasons. There were higher murder rates, higher crime rates, et cetera. And then that's going down. Violence is decreasing drastically over time. And then we had things like just like a whole bunch of patriarchal and extremely sexist societies. And now we're moving more towards equality between the sexes. And that's just sort of spreading. It used to be that throughout history, almost all countries were dictatorships. And now democracy is spread around half the world, right? 200 years ago, there were approximately zero democracies, and now it's about half the world. And it looks like it's going to spread to the rest of the world. Okay, so now we describe these all as changes in the same direction in a certain sense towards liberal values. Okay, and the evolutionary debunkers do not have an account of this. Right. So like they could try explaining the values that people used to have in the past. So if there are evolutionary explanations of that, then they can't explain the modern liberal values. Right? Because like the change is too fast for to be explained by biological evolution. Right? And so it looks like what's happening is that we're overcoming the biases that were inculcated into us by our genes. Right. So like the reason why people would attack neighboring tribes for trivial reasons was plausibly there's an evolutionary explanation for that. Right? It was that, well, you kill the men of the neighboring tribe, then you get to kidnap the women. And if you do that, then you increase your reproductive success. Okay. But then, okay, so like that's a plausible explanation, but then that doesn't explain the decrease in that practice over time, right? The decrease in that practice appears to be explained by our overcoming the bias that evolution produced and realizing what was actually good, right? Maybe that's not the only way of explaining this, but like that's a natural way of thinking about it. And that is what happens in all other areas of human intellectual endeavor, that there's a gradual convergence over time. And in all other areas of inquiry, people start out completely wrong, just like having completely wrong ideas. And then gradually over time, they converge. So theories about the origin of the earth vary a lot between different societies, like in sort of like traditional primitive cultures, right? There are all sorts of different theories about how the earth originated, and they're all 100% wrong. But now if you go to like almost any society in the world, there's a broad convergence on where the earth came from, right? And that's because we figured it out, right? And so and you'll just see that in lots of different areas. And so like it's plausible to think, oh, that's what happened in ethics. We started out completely wrong, and then we're like more and more getting towards the truth, right?
That's right. I asked you about if you was familiarized with some kinds of different versions of the argument, because there are explanationist versions, there are telic versions or teleological versions, and there are modal versions. Do you know about these kinds of versions, these different versions?
I'm not sure. You'll have to tell me about those.
Right. I think it would be good to get the light too much long, so maybe other time we can
Okay.
talk about this. Right. So there is a 14th question. The fourth question is the 14th question is the how you deal with the framing effect objection. Is that objection about the framing effect that people can have under intuitions with
Hmm.
the way you tell some kind of case, some specific example, or some kind of uh, some kind of intuition that you try to elicit on someone using some kind of example, some kind of mental experiment and other things like
Yeah.
that you told to people, you tell to people that stuff, and people just have some kind of intuition depending on how you phrase those cases.
Yeah, yeah.
In the way we describe some thought experiments, uh, manipulate the intuitions of other people in problematic ways, in ways
Yeah.
that distort their intuitions about those cases. If this is the case, how we can distinguish between reliable intuitions from unreliable ones?
Yeah, good. I've heard, a couple of examples of how people's moral judgments could be influenced. But by the way, when people talk about the intuitions, they're really not very serious about intuition. Right? That is, what happened was just like they asked participants in a study, how wrong do you think such and such is? They didn't ask if it was intuitive. So for all we know, they might have gone through some reasoning and possibly spurious reasoning, right? We don't really know that it was intuitive. But anyway, okay. So people's moral judgments could be influenced by irrelevant things. So like there was one example where if you're in a messy room, you tend to make harsher moral judgments. Right? There's a messy room with like used pizza boxes around or something. And then, in the other condition, you're in a clean room, and then people make more lenient moral judgments or something like that. Um, uh, let's see. Think about framing effect. Oh, so there's an effect where if you describe a medical intervention in terms of the success rate, people have different reactions than if you describe it in terms of the failure rate. So like, okay, so here's a treatment, and like 80% of the people are going to live. That sounds better than here's a treatment and 20% of the people are going to die. But that's the same thing. Okay. Right. So, okay. But now, like you know, the, when philosophers hear about this, like one of the things that philosophers do is like, they just have an extremely coarse-grained way of reading things. It's like, oh, either factor A influences you or doesn't. They don't look at quantities. Like, okay. Like they never tell you like what is the size of the effect. It was statistically significant, but what's the effect size? Okay, so like you're supposed to rate something on a scale of 1 to 7, right? Okay, and like so let's say the effect that the psychologist discovered was that when you're in the messy room, your rating goes up by zero point 0.5 on average on a scale of 1 to 7. Okay, and you're being asked to rate something that is really very subjective and that there is no clear answer to. Right? There's some sort of like ambiguous action. So basically, they're trying to maximize the effect, right? So it's not like, hey, what do you think about murder? And like people think it's okay if they're in a clean room. No, that never happens, right? It's something that's kind of ambiguous, and they ask you to evaluate it, okay? And then like maybe it shifts your evaluation by zero point 0.5 on a 7-point scale. And then okay, so now I'm supposed to conclude that nobody knows anything about ethics. Like, this is ridiculous, right? You can get effects like that with descriptive judgments too, okay? Right, so, like here, this is a famous experiment, the Ash conformity experiment, where people are supposed to judge the lengths of different lines, right? And then if you're in a room with other people who are giving the incorrect answer out loud, then that causes you to misjudge the lengths of lines. So that's a descriptive fact, right? And okay, and like some of the people who make that judgment, some of them are just lying. Some of them on exit interview, um, claim to have actually believed that their answer was correct, even though it was visibly incorrect. So anyway, but and the point being, nobody says, "Oh my God, we can't know about physical reality." Like that would just be ridiculous, right? But that's the sort of thing that anti-realists say. There's like in some special circumstances, you can get some like small influence on people's moral judgment. Oh my God, now we can't know anything about. Now we don't know if murder is wrong or not. Like that's sort of like saying, maybe we don't know about physical reality.
That's right.
Professor Michael Huemer, last question. Uh, what is the main takeaway you want readers to have after reading Progressive Myths? Fortunately, I haven't finished reading your new book, but
Yeah.
I feel that one big issues today is that morality in our times has a bureaucratic characteristics. Um, we live to act according to group and have lost to ability to reflection. Your book is it's
Yeah.
thinking already Raven.
Yeah, I think, well, the main thing I'm hoping is that people will be more suspicious when they hear propaganda. Like, we're subjected to a lot of propaganda, but people don't always recognize that that's what's happening. Like they often think that they're being educated and they're learning the facts about an issue when what they're actually learning is talking points from political activists. Right. And like, okay, and so like what I'm hoping will happen is like you'll read the book and then you'll see a bunch of things that you heard that you thought were facts. And then you're going to hear that they're actually not facts, right? And that they're like bogus propaganda, right? And the like it's not unusual. Like I didn't just cherry pick a small number. Like I have 20 myths, but that's only because I can't fit all of them. I wanted this to have a, to be readable, to be short enough, okay? But like this happens over and over again. Almost every time you hear persuasive political content, like somebody giving you an argument for a controversial political view, and then they give you some facts about it, some quote facts, almost every time it is either a lie or just blatantly misleading if you knew the context. And I want people to like have that as a standing assumption. you, anytime you're talking to some like political activist and they're telling you the facts that support their side, your immediate assumption would be, I bet that's not true. That's what you should think. Right. And by the way, it's not just leftists, obviously. Right. It's just like, people who have a strong ideological stance do that.
Professor Michael Huemer, thank you so much for your time and insights. It was an honor to have you here, and I truly appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh,
And I
no,
hope we
thanks
can
for having
speak
me.
again in the future.
Thanks. It's been great talking to you.